Paideia, it's nice to see all of you. Hope you're having a good day. I'm here to introduce Bill Linney, today's speaker. So Bill played the saxophone in the United States Army band Pershing's Own for 20 years. That's pretty cool. After retiring from the Army in 2019, he earned a master's degree in classics from the University of Maryland. He's now working on a Ph.D. in the Department of Greek and Latin at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. His interests include Bronze Age writing systems, Semitics, the ancient Near East, archaeology, and publishing. He's the author of the book, Getting Started with Latin. What's harder, Latin or the saxophone?
Oh, goodness. Well, the music business can be tough. So I would say this is comparatively easier. But
okay, great. Well, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to my presentation today. My topic is origin stories, Athenian political myths of the 5th century BC and their Herodotean subversion. Let's jump in. Let me start my clock here. Let's jump in with a little bit of history to get us started. In the 5th century BC, the Greeks formed a mutual defense league against the Persians in the days following the Persian Wars. And you can see it here on the map, outlined in yellow. That's the Delian League at its height. Athens was the leader of this league. But over time, it became more of an Athenian empire as the Athenians became more tyrannical and bullying toward their member states. While this is happening in the 5th century, we start to see new narratives coming from Athenians, narratives that we could refer to as political myths, and we'll unpack that a bit more as we go along. We see this kind of phenomenon in history quite a bit. Nations that are trying to expand their horizons, expand their land holdings, they often develop political myths to go along with their expansion. Political myths can provide a mental and emotional framework within which a people group can visualize the success that it thinks it deserves. In the United States, for example, we've seen manifest destiny. In European colonialism, we've seen certain racist tropes. Lots of political myths coming from Nazi Germany. And so in the 5th century, the Athenians promoted new political myths and narratives to justify their rise to hegemony at the head of the Delian League. And one thing I want to focus on today is that these narratives contained an ethnic component that tapped into existing narratives of Greek myth. So that's part of what we'll be looking at today. The name myth suggests that something might not be true, right? So it doesn't matter if a political myth is true or not. What matters is if a political myth can be successful in manipulating the emotions. Not so much aimed at the intellect, but at the emotions. So a political myth, or slogan perhaps, can build popular emotional appeal for something, help to achieve a political goal, and it can help a nation to articulate what it thinks it deserves for whatever reasons such as their origins, perceived ethnic superiority, past accomplishments, land claims, and even relationship to a particular deity. So these are patterns we see in history. Scholar Dietrich Orlow writes that political myths can, quote, oversimplify or even distort objective reality for the conscious or unconscious purpose of increasing emotional mass support for a particular leader or party. So my thesis in kind of a simplified way is this. The Athenians used political myths and ethnic propaganda to raise their status as they rise to leadership at the head of the Delian League. But Herodotus, in his historical writings, he starts to push back against that narrative and bring them back down to earth. So we'll be unpacking this in a more complex way as we go along. There's a great book out there called The Mirror of Herodotus by Francois Hartog. And in this book, Hartog demonstrates that Herodotus was known to complicate the simple dichotomy of Greek versus barbarian. There's more to it than that. And in fact, he blurred the lines between Greek and barbarian. And so this is the kind of literary context for the things that I'm saying today about Herodotus and the kinds of things that Herodotus was saying in his histories. Before we go on, let's take a quick look at some of the major ethnic groups that we find in the ancient Greek world. Over on the right in purple, you see Ionia. Much of what we're talking about today will pertain to Ionia. Above that, Aeolia on the western coast of Asia Minor. Attica is in pink, that's where Athens is, and the brown areas are Doric areas. So these are some of the main linguistic and ethnic groups in the ancient Greek world. Speaking of ethnicity, Herodotus himself, who lived in the 5th century, he spent much of his life traveling, but he was originally from a place called Halicarnassus in the extreme southwest corner of Asia Minor. And so this territory, I've been told, is right, it's a little spot that's Dorian in ethnicity, but it's right on the edge of Ionian territory. And so therefore Herodotus knew and wrote in the Ionic dialect. And so my point here is that he's not Athenian, even though he visited Athens. He himself is not Athenian, and therefore he's not under any obligation to buy into Athenian propaganda. Keep in mind that when we talk about ancient Greek ethnography, this is before 23andMe. You couldn't just send your DNA off to the lab for a complete analysis to tell you your ethnicity. So for the ancient Greeks, genealogical myths and stories had a lot of meaning. They gave groups a genuine sense of how they fit into the larger scheme, the ethnic scheme of the ancient Greek world. And so for these ancient Greeks, there wasn't really any difference between a real ancestry and a mythic ancestry. So what we start to see is perceived ethnicity. Whatever a group believed about itself, that became their ethnicity in their minds just because they believed it. And we see this coming from scholars such as Jonathan M. Hall, who teaches at the University of Chicago. He's written widely on Greek ethnography. And here's a quote from Jonathan M. Hall. He says, "An ethnic group should be defined as a social collectivity whose members are united by their subscription to a putative belief in a shared descent and to an association with a primordial homeland." Likewise, Edith Hall, as she explains the difference between subjective ethnicity and objective ethnicity, she writes that, quote, "Subjective ethnicity describes the ideology of an ethnic group by defining as shared its ancestors, history, language, etc., and is therefore a social construct." So what we start to see is that ethnicity really is perception of ethnicity. And this pertains to my thesis. Because ethnicity existed mainly in the mind, it was easy to redo it, retell it, refurbish it, and manipulate it. And that's what we see scholars talking about. And so new narratives could simply replace old narratives. Much in the same way as on your computer, if you install a new version of the software, it replaces and overwrites completely the old version of the software. You can kind of do that with ethnic narratives. Let's take a look at the family tree of Greek ethnicity as it maps onto Greek myth. So this kind of family tree is presented differently in different Greek literature, but this is one of the earliest representations we have as given in Hesiod. So we have Prometheus, who gave fire to human beings in a fennel stalk. His son Deucalion, who survived the flood along with his wife Pyrrha. And then they had a son named Helen. Now this is not Helen, Queen of Sparta, that's a different Helen. This is Helen with 2 L's, progenitor of the Greeks, and that's where we get words like Hellenistic, right? So his son Doris, other son Aeolus, and grandson Ion, that's where we get Dorians, Aeolians, and Ionians. So we'll circle back to this family tree diagram in a moment. Let's talk now about some of the political myths we see coming from Athens in the 5th century. Let's take a look at some of the specifics. I've divided these into 3 loose categories or subject headings, the first of which is colonization propaganda. So we know that the Ionians migrated from west to east across the Aegean and settled in the west coast of Asia Minor. So that's Ionia there in purple. To the Ionians, they viewed themselves as having come directly from the Peloponnese, but the Athenians wanted to portray them as colonists of their city. So there's tension between those 2 narratives, and so this is what scholar Charles Hedrick calls colonization propaganda. And we see this for one place, for example, in Herodotus Book 8. In this particular story, it's during the Persian War, and Themistocles, the Athenian general, is displeased with the Ionians because they're fighting on the side of the Persians. So he scratches a message into the rocks for them to see the next day, sending them sort of an ancient text message, right? So he says to them, "Men of Ionia, you do wrongly to fight against your fathers." And he goes on to say, "You were made from us." So he asserts that the Ionians came from Athens, that Athens is the mother city. By the way, the word metropolis literally means mother city. It's comprised of the Greek words mater, which means mother, and polis, which means city. So metropolis in English, literally mother city. And so he's asserting that the Ionians are merely colonists. And for this reason, he's saying that the Ionians owe their military and political loyalty to the Athenians. Another big place where we see this kind of colonization propaganda is in a play by Euripides called Ion. Throughout the play, the main character Ion, progenitor of the Ionians, is troubled because he doesn't know who his real parents are. And therefore he doesn't know how he fits into Greek society. And so at the end of the play, it's kind of a long story. Literally, the play's a long story. But at the end of the play, we have a classic example of the deus ex machina. Athena appears and explains how everything is going to work. And so here's what she says at the end of the play. Athena says, "His sons, 4, born from a single stock, blah, 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 they shall dwell in the plains in 2 continents on either side of the dividing sea." So what is she saying here as she explains how everything is going to work? The entire play takes place the actual setting is Delphi, but the subject matter of the play pertains to the Athenian royal family, Athenian ethnicity, and Ionian ethnicity. So when she says that the sons of Ion will dwell in 2 continents on either side of the sea, she's presupposing that they'll come from this newly presented Athenian Ion. Therefore, anyone who makes it to the east side of the Aegean logically would have to come from this source. So she's presenting a purely Athenian Ion. This, logically, it makes the Athenians the mother city, and it makes Ionians colonists. So this is a big source for this kind of narrative that scholars look at. Moving on to subject heading 2, let's take a look at Athenian takeover of Ionian religion. Here on the map we have the tiny island of Delos, which is a small island, but very important because it was the center of Ionian religion. It was the traditional birthplace of Apollo. Furthermore, it was the meeting place of the Delian League, and in fact that's where the name of the Delian League comes from, the island of Delos. But all the things that were important about Delos, the Athenians wanted to shift all that importance away from Delos and back to Athens, so that Athens could be the center of everything. So they take the treasury of the Delian League, which was stored on the island of Delos, and they take that back, for safekeeping of course, take it back to Athens in 454. Soon after that time, the Athenians made peace with the Persians and with the Spartans, with whom they had lots of conflicts during the 5th century. So they didn't quite need that cash as much for fighting wars. So what they started to do was divert that money toward the repair and restoration of temples that had been destroyed roughly 50 years before during the Persian Wars, especially when the Persians sacked Athens. And in fact, they start to divert an enormous amount of money toward the art and architecture of the Parthenon. Then they stop using Delos as the meeting place for the Delian League, and they sort of take it over, and they start taking over all the religious practice that goes on there. They start making new rules, such as you're not allowed to have graves on the island of Delos anymore. And in short, they establish Athens as the center of Ionian religious activity. Subject heading 3, genealogical myths of Athenian ethnic superiority. Now, of course, these subject headings are interrelated. They're sort of loose categories, but I needed some way to organize what I'm saying. So let's circle back for a moment to the play Ion by Euripides. And let's take another look at the deus ex machina at the end. And let's look at another key phrase that Athena says during her speech. She says, "His sons," that is the sons of Ion, "born from a single stock." Okay, so this is an ethnic claim. When she says born from a single stock, that's suggesting ethnic purity. Okay? So she's saying Ionian ethnicity starts right here at Athens. And it's also saying that if you're not from this stock, ethnically speaking, you're not really Ionian. So if you're Ionian, that means that your ancestors have to be from Athens. Again, she's presenting this Athenian brand of Ion. And one scholar I read said that it makes Athens the pure source of the Athenian fountain, or something like that. Another thing that happens in the play is there's an adjustment to the traditional family tree of Greek mythology. Notice that Xuthus, the previous father of Ion, now has been replaced by the god Apollo as the biological father of Ion. Now, keep in mind that Xuthus was a foreign king of Athens. He was not from Athens. So by removing Xuthus and replacing him with Apollo, you remove a sense of foreignness from Ion's pedigree. His mother, Creusa, was an Athenian native, and in fact, daughter of the mythical figure Erechtheus, who was supposed to be born from the soil. That concept is called autochthony, right? So this new setup for Ion's pedigree suggests a thoroughly Athenian ethnicity for Ion. And some scholars point to the fact that during this time, the Athenians were tightening up their requirements to be considered an Athenian citizen. So some scholars find a connection between this kind of narrative and the political realities at Athens at this time. Again, it suggests ethnic purity. It suggests that Athens is the source of Ionian ethnicity. Again, it circles back to my first point, making Athens the parent city of a colony. But look at one other thing that happens. It gives the Athenians a special and intimate relationship with Apollo, who is the traditional god of Ionian religion. And in fact, archaeologists have found a temple in Athens called the Temple of Apollo Patroklos, the Temple of Fatherly Apollo. But scholars aren't really sure where this narrative comes from. They're not sure if Euripides innovated it or if it existed before him. There's not much evidence, and scholars have to do a little bit of guesswork, but that's an interesting thing to look at, is where this new innovation come from. Scholar Sarah Forsdyke has some very useful observations that can help us contextualize what we're seeing here. She says, in ancient Greece, even ethnic identity itself seems to have been something that groups could discard and adopt according to need. And she says, over the course of the 6th and 5th centuries, the Athenians seem to have adopted Ionian ethnicity, then distanced themselves from it, only to lay claim to it again. So there's a real malleability or flexibility with how people can conceive of their ethnicity at this time. And scholars are reflecting on it. In his excellent commentary on the Ion, scholar Gunther Martin has a quote that just really ties it all up, ties up all the threads into a neat package. I'll just read it to you quickly just because it's so good. Apart from the stress on purity, it is also by the genealogy it promulgates that Ion attributes to the Athenians a privileged place in the family of the Greeks. The Athenians become ancestors of the Ionians, which implies the obligation of loyalty and subordination to the metropolis, whereas in older versions, the two groups had been related in ways that gave them an equal standing. So what we see here are new narratives of ethnic superiority coming from 5th century Athens that correspond to their rise to power at the head of the Delian League. Now, as I close, let's take a look at how Herodotus pushed back against these narratives. And surprisingly, the way he does it is by questioning the Greekness of the Athenians. Now, that may surprise you. You may think to yourself, well, who can be more Greek than the Athenians? But nevertheless, that is what he does. Let's take a look at how Herodotus questions their Greekness. We'll just take a look at a few spots. Herodotus, Book 1, he says, these races, Ionian and Dorian, were the foremost in ancient time. The first a Pelasgian and the second a Hellenic people. So let's break down for a moment what he's saying. He's saying Dorians are Hellenic, but Ionians are Pelasgian. In Herodotus, the Pelasgians are always depicted as not Greek. He's very clear about this. So what he's saying boldly is that Ionians are not Greek, and by extension, the Athenians are not Greek either. Again, in Book 8, he says, the Athenians, while the Pelasgians ruled what is now called Hellas, were Pelasgians, bearing the name of Chroni, etc., etc. They changed their name and became Athenians. So he's saying, again, originally they were Pelasgians. Herodotus always depicts Pelasgians as not Greek. Therefore, the Athenians, ethnically speaking, started out as not Greek, and they just became Ionian due to a name change, a rebranding, if you will. Back to Book 1, he makes a bold claim about the relationship that the Athenians have with the Greek language. He says, the Pelasgians spoke a language which was not Greek. If then all the Pelasgian stock so spoke, then the Attic nation, being of Pelasgian blood, must have changed its language too at the time when it became part of the Hellenes. So what's he saying? The Athenians were Pelasgian, that is, not Greek. The Athenians had to learn Greek, and this suggests a process of acculturation. They had to just become Greek. So what is he saying here with this claim about their language? Edward Anson says that Herodotus refers to the Greek language as the defining element, the decisive criterion for who gets to be Greek. So it's really, this claim about their language is really important, and I would suggest to you that he's making a very strong claim here. So, in closing, Herodotus questions the Greekness of the Athenians in three ways: by saying they're really Pelasgians, by saying that they only became Hellenes due to a name change, and that they had to learn the Greek language. So why is he doing this? What is Herodotus up to? My thesis is that Herodotus is saying these things in response to Athenian ethnic claims and political myths and narratives that we see during the 5th century that accompany their rise to power at the head of the Delian League. And so Herodotus is pushing back against those narratives, given the fact that he himself is not Athenian. So that's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Very interesting. This is obviously a thing that happens frequently. People try to position origin stories for political agendas. One thinks of Julius Caesar's and Augustus's attempts to trace his own lineage back to Troy and Aeneas, or even such outlandish attempts as, I don't know if you ever heard of Israel Britannic descent, where the Brits attempted, I believe, to argue that they were the sort of lost tribe of Israel, and that the Muslims were actually not descended from Ishmael, Isaac and Ishmael, but in fact the Brits were, and that would sort of just connected them to the Bible. So I'm wondering, like, have you thought about this beyond just this context and looked for patterns across cultures when this happened?
Yes, especially as a student of the ancient Near East. For example, Hatshepsut, the queen pharaoh of the New Kingdom, Egypt, she once she became pharaoh, she legitimized her rule, and you can see all this on the walls of her famous temple across from Luxor. There's a whole narrative about her having some kind of supernatural birth. So these new narratives can legitimize someone's rule. There are a million different ways to use political narratives, political myths. In the Enuma Elish, we see Marduk. In ancient Babylon, Marduk was the patron god of the city of Babylon. And so as Babylonian power grew, we see the Enuma Elish, which is a story in which Marduk takes over and becomes king of the gods through his heroic deeds. So as the power of the city of Babylon increases, so do the fortunes of their patron god Marduk. So there, in short, to answer your question, there are a million examples of that kind of thing throughout history and myth. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please.
So one of the interesting implications of what you're talking about with Herodotus is that it seems that he's also positing that it is possible to become Greek. Which is interesting, right? Because we also get in Herodotus the four things that make you Greek are blood, religion, customs, and language. And so how do you, I guess, reconcile that tension between you can not be Greek and become Greek, but also blood is a component of ethnic identity?
You know, until you just mentioned it, I hadn't thought of it. I had been thinking about it from the angle of him kind of pushing back against the Athenians, but I hadn't thought about the other implications of it, which suggests that he, as you say, he's saying you can become Greek. So it would seem like you could become Greek if you undergo an acculturation process. But I would point to language as an extremely important element of this. Who speaks Greek and how well they speak it is a big deal. And oftentimes in Greek literature, they make fun of people from other cities who don't speak Greek quite as well as them. Aristophanes, for example, I've seen him do that. So that's a very interesting point. I hadn't really thought that much about it.
Language maybe can override blood.
There's a lot of material there to think about, which it sounds like you're a little ahead of me on that.
Perhaps, but I appreciated this talk a lot.
Great point. Thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
I have a follow-up to that. You were just mentioning about the language. Did you, in your research on this, did you read much where it prioritizes prioritizes one of the dialects over the other in terms of origin or? Like, because it seems like something they would argue over, as you said.
Well, on a linguistic note, the Athenians borrowed a lot of characters from the Ionians. The Ionians had many improved letters in their alphabet. Up until approximately 430, 420, generally speaking, the Athenians didn't have double consonants, and they didn't have an omega either. They used omicron for both long and short O values. So then they borrowed some Ionian letters to help shore up their alphabet. So I don't know. That's another good question. But definitely some very strong dialects. For the letter eta, Semitic letter hate, in places where it has in dialects where there is no aspiration, it becomes an epsilon. In places where it does have an aspiration, it becomes the letter heta, which is where we get our H from. Oh. So that's there's a lot of interesting stuff there with the development of the Greek, what we call epicoric alphabets. Yes, I think we have time for one last question.
Hopefully it's a good one. That's on a note, actually, towards what you just mentioned. It's been a while since I've read Herodotus, and you only quoted a few passages. I guess my question is does he give evidence, like, to say, oh no, actually, the Athenians are Pelasgian and were not originally Greek? Or is he just, he said, she said? Like, what can he actually point to, what can anyone have actually pointed to with examples such as yours of, okay, they invented this letter clearly before it went to other regions of Greece?
Their beliefs about ethnicity don't always map on to what we know now about ethnicity. And as I mentioned before, a lot of this is just perceptions, stories, largely connected to myth. So it doesn't map onto what a modern historiographer would know about ancient ethnicity. And in fact, Greek ethnography, Jonathan M. Hall would be a great author to read if you're interested in that topic. There's a lot to talk about there. So,
thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you.